My name is Adrian Voss. I'm 34 years old, founder and CEO of a company that just crossed $20 million in annual revenue. On paper, I've achieved more than I ever imagined in my 20s. But if you ask my father, none of it matters. To him, I've always been the reckless dreamer who refused to get a real job. I didn't grow up hearing praise. I grew up under the constant weight of expectations, the kind my father thought were universal truths. College degree, safe career, steady paycheck, preferably in law, medicine, or finance. Anything else was a detour into failure. In 2016, I ignored all of it. I started a company in the then small but fast-growing world of artificial intelligence. My father told me I was throwing my life away. And maybe, in the early days when I had more debt than clients, it looked that way. But I had an idea I believed in. I had the stubbornness to see it through. What he never acknowledged, and maybe never will, is that while I was chasing that dream, I was also helping him. Quietly. When my mom got sick and the insurance didn't cover certain treatments, I wrote the checks. When the roof of their house started leaking, I paid the contractors. I didn't ask for thanks. I told myself I was just doing what a son should do. The night everything changed started like any other. I had just come home from a meeting that would redefine the future of my company. We'd secured 2 major contracts, the kind that would push our projected revenue past $20 million a year. Driving back, I thought about telling my father. Maybe for once, I'd see pride in his eyes. Instead, I walked into a storm. He was sitting in the living room, arms crossed, jaw tight. The argument began over something small, a family gathering I couldn't attend because of a business trip. His voice rose, mine stayed calm. Then he snapped. "Pack your bags and get out. You're a lowlife. I don't want you under my roof." The words hung in the air like smoke. My mother froze. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I knew nothing would change his mind. Numbers wouldn't matter, success wouldn't matter. Not to him. I walked upstairs, filled 2 suitcases with the essentials, and came back down without looking at him. He didn't ask where I was going. He didn't ask if I was okay. By sunrise the next morning, I was on the coastal highway to Florida. 2 years earlier, I had bought a beach house there, a place I rarely visited. I told myself I'd enjoy it someday. Now, someday had arrived sooner than expected. The sound of the waves was my welcome. The salt in the air, my reset. As I placed my bags in the master bedroom, I felt a strange mix of freedom and emptiness. For years, I had been chasing the approval of a man who had no intention of giving it. The first morning in Florida, I woke to sunlight cutting through white curtains and the steady rhythm of the ocean outside. It was a strange kind of peace, the kind that comes when the noise you've lived with for years suddenly stops. No lectures, no sighs of disappointment, no questions about when I'd grow up. I made coffee and sat on the deck, watching the waves roll in. For the first time in a long time, I could think clearly. My father's words still echoed in my mind. Lowlife, as if all the years I'd spent building something from nothing, all the nights I'd worked until dawn, counted for nothing. It wasn't just the insult. It was the fact that he meant it. Here's the thing about me. I don't respond with shouting or fists. I've never believed in that kind of fight. My weapon has always been patience. Let the other person swing wildly in anger. Let them show their cards. I keep mine close until the time is right. So I didn't call him. I didn't try to explain. I didn't tell him that the night he told me to leave, my company had just signed deals that would put us on the front page of tech publications. Instead, I poured my energy into the work. Every email, every investor update, every development sprint became fuel. I wanted my company to thrive. Not just for me, but so that one day, when the truth came out, it would be undeniable. The irony was that my father didn't just underestimate me. He relied on me more than he realized. Over the years, I had paid for things quietly, without turning them into favors. My parents never saw the wires I sent to cover their overdue property taxes. They never knew the anonymous donor to my niece's college fund was me. And now, cut off and out of sight, I knew they'd start to feel the absence. By the end of the first week, I'd settled into a rhythm. Mornings for work, afternoons for running along the beach, evenings for planning. Not planning revenge in the usual sense, no elaborate traps or confrontations, but thinking through the inevitable moment our paths would cross again. When that day came, I didn't just want to tell my father he was wrong. I wanted him to see it, feel it, and realize that the life he dismissed as worthless had eclipsed anything he could have imagined. I kept my circle small. Only my closest friend, Marcus, knew I was in Florida. He'd been with me since the early days of the company, back when we were working out of a one-bedroom apartment stacked with takeout boxes and computer parts. He knew the story, and he didn't waste time with pity. His advice was simple: build, win, then decide if they even deserve to know. 3 weeks passed quickly. Contracts closed, our revenue charts climbed. I watched from my deck as the sun set over the water, knowing that somewhere, hundreds of miles away, my father still thought I was floundering. That was fine. Let him believe it. What he didn't know was that distance wasn't defeat, it was preparation. I wasn't hiding, I was sharpening. And when the time came to step back into his world, I would do it on my terms, not his. In the meantime, I lived quietly, answered only to myself, and let the ocean wash away whatever lingering doubt I had carried from that night. He had told me to leave. I had. But he would learn, in the most undeniable way possible, that I'd been moving forward all along. By the 4th week in Florida, I had stopped thinking about my father's voice echoing in my head every morning. Or at least I thought I had. The truth is, certain words have a way of sitting under your skin, even when you try to wash them out with ocean water and work. One evening, after a string of calls with investors, I got an email from my sister, Claire. She doesn't write often, not because we don't get along, but because she's busy raising 2 kids and managing her own life. Her message was short. You might want to know Dad's been talking to people about you. I called her immediately. She sounded hesitant, like she wasn't sure she wanted to be having this conversation. It's not just that night, she said finally. He's been saying for months that you're unstable, that your company is one bad decision away from collapsing, that you've been reckless with money. Reckless with money? That was rich, considering how much of mine had quietly kept the family afloat over the years. Why would he? I started, then stopped. Claire sighed. Adrian, I think he's trying to convince people you're not dependable. Some of his friends, a couple of cousins, I don't know why, but I figured you'd want to know. When we hung up, I sat on the deck staring at the waves. It was one thing for him to throw me out in anger. It was another to actively work against me. That took intention. That meant it wasn't just an outburst. It was a campaign. Over the next few days, little pieces started falling into place. A potential investor who had seemed eager in January suddenly pulled back, citing concerns about stability. An old family friend who usually called me for tech advice stopped returning my messages. Even my old basketball coach, who I'd known since high school, sounded different when we spoke. Cautious, guarded. It wasn't paranoia. My father had reach, and he knew how to use it. As a well-respected figure in his community, a retired corporate executive with a network built over decades, his opinion carried weight. And he was spending that social capital not to build me up, but to tear me down. The realization was cold. My father wasn't just disappointed in me. He saw me as a threat to his narrative. In his mind, I wasn't supposed to succeed without doing it his way. If I did, it would prove he'd been wrong all along. And that was something his pride couldn't tolerate. One night, I walked to the shoreline under a moon so bright that it painted the waves silver. I thought about every quiet contribution I'd made to the family, every bill I'd paid, every crisis I'd smoothed over without a word. None of it had been enough. It never would be. That's when my thinking shifted. This wasn't about getting my father's approval anymore. It wasn't even about proving him wrong. It was about protecting what I'd built. My company, my name, my integrity, from someone willing to sabotage it for the sake of control. The next morning, I called Marcus. I think my father's been working against me. I need to know for sure, and I need to find out how far it goes. He didn't hesitate. Then we dig, quietly. No one sees it coming. For the first time since I'd left home, I felt the edge of a plan forming. If my father wanted to play politics, I'd play strategy. The difference was, I'd learned to build from nothing. He was about to find out what that kind of resilience could do when it turned toward defense, and maybe even offense. Marcus arrived in Florida 2 days later, carrying nothing but a backpack and that quiet confidence he's always had. We've been friends for over a decade, the kind where you don't need to fill every silence because both of you know the wheels are turning. We sat on my deck overlooking the ocean, a legal pad between us, and I laid it out. Everything Claire had told me, every strange withdrawal of support I'd noticed in the last month. "Your father's not sloppy," Marcus said finally. "If he's making moves, he's doing it through people, friends, associates, maybe even people you'd never suspect. The first step is finding the pattern." I nodded. This wasn't going to be about confronting him directly. That would be like charging into a chess game blindfolded. I needed information first, and the kind of information that, once gathered, couldn't be denied or spun into another version of his truth. We decided to start by mapping my father's network. Marcus was good at that, tracing connections, identifying who spoke to whom, where influence flowed. While he worked his angles, I began reaching out to contacts I trusted, people far enough removed from my father's orbit to speak freely. The picture that emerged was as sharp as it was unsettling. At least 4 business contacts had cooled toward me after hearing things about my leadership style. 2 potential hires had backed out after my father warned them about instability in my company. And a local journalist, someone who had been planning a feature on our latest AI breakthrough, told me she'd been advised by a reliable source that my work was overhyped and likely a bubble. She didn't name him, but she didn't have to. It was surgical. My father wasn't trying to destroy me outright. That would have been too obvious. He was seeding doubt, just enough to make people hesitate before working with me. In business, hesitation can be as deadly as outright refusal. By the end of that week, I knew 2 things. First, my father had underestimated my ability to track his moves. Second, he'd made the mistake of playing a long game against someone who had spent his entire career building endurance. I didn't want revenge that would burn everything down. That wasn't my style. I wanted something cleaner. I wanted to take away his leverage, to make sure that whatever story he was telling could no longer stick. And I wanted to do it in a way that he would understand without me having to spell it out. The plan formed slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Step 1, strengthen my position in a way that made his narrative impossible to believe. That meant securing high-profile partnerships, ones that came with public recognition. Step 2, document everything. Every email, every conversation, every instance of interference traced back to him or his circle. Step 3, prepare a moment. One opportunity where I could lay the truth bare, not just for him, but for anyone who'd ever doubted me. Marcus called it the reveal. I called it the moment he realizes the board has flipped. We didn't rush. That was the T. Impatience was the enemy. I knew my father would keep talking. Men like him can't resist repeating their own version of the truth. The more he did, the more I could collect. And when the time came, I wouldn't just show him my success, I'd show him the receipts of every move he'd made against me.
One evening, as Marcus left to catch his flight home, he turned to me. He said, "You know, you're not just defending your business here. You're redefining the way he sees you, and maybe for the first time, making him realize he can't control you." I watched the sun dip into the horizon and thought about that. He was right. This wasn't just about a company or even a family feud. It was about taking back the narrative of my own life and making sure no one could rewrite it but me.
The first move was subtle. No announcements, no press releases, just quiet, deliberate action. I started reaching out to a short list of people I'd met over the years who not only respected my work, but carried influence in circles my father could never penetrate. These weren't investors or family friends. They were leaders in sectors that valued results over pedigree, the kind who didn't care where you came from, only what you could deliver. One of them was the CTO of a major robotics firm we'd collaborated with on a project 18 months earlier. Over a video call, I explained my vision for a new joint venture, integrating our AI with their autonomous systems for industrial applications. The concept wasn't just solid, it was revolutionary. Within a week, we'd signed an MOU and they were ready to go public with it. I knew that one headline could dismantle weeks of whispered doubt. But one headline wasn't enough. It had to be a wave. So I lined up 3 more strategic partnerships, each one in a different sector: healthcare diagnostics, supply chain automation, and defense technology. Every agreement came with its own press coverage, interviews, and feature pieces. The tech media loves momentum, and I made sure to feed them just enough to keep the story alive for weeks. My father's version of me, unstable, reckless, didn't stand a chance against photos of me shaking hands with industry leaders and articles outlining 8-figure contracts. While that part of the plan rolled forward, Marcus worked on step 2, documenting the interference. We didn't approach this like angry relatives. We approached it like building a legal case. Every time a potential hire backed out citing personal advice, we traced the connection. Every time an investor hesitated, we noted the timing and the conversation. We even got confirmation from 2 separate sources that my father had directly suggested I was on the verge of bankruptcy. That last part made me laugh. The company's cash reserves alone could keep us running for 3 years without a cent of new revenue. The more evidence we gathered, the calmer I became. I wasn't interested in shaming him for the sake of it. This was about precision. My father had chosen to undermine me quietly. I would dismantle his narrative publicly, but in a way that left no room for him to claim victimhood. Step 3, the reveal, was already taking shape. I was scheduled to be the keynote speaker at an AI and Emerging Technologies Summit in New York. The audience would be packed with industry leaders, journalists, and by coincidence, several people from my father's professional network. That would be the stage. Not to attack him, but to present the unvarnished reality of what I'd built, the kind of reality that made every rumor look absurd. I didn't tell Claire or my mother what I was planning, not because I wanted to keep them in the dark, but because I knew they'd try to soften the blow for him. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about clarity. Some truths need to arrive without warning, so there's no time to construct defenses. As the partnerships went live and media coverage stacked up, I imagined my father reading the headlines. Maybe he ignored them, maybe he pretended not to care, but I knew they chipped away at the story he'd been telling. Every handshake I posted, every article that praised our work was a counterpunch he couldn't stop. By the end of the second month, the board was set. The pieces were in place. And the man who'd called me a lowlife was about to find himself surrounded, with no move left but to face the truth. It started as a slow drip. A LinkedIn post here, a news article there. People in my father's network began sharing interviews I'd done, tagging their own thoughts about innovation and resilience. At first, I thought maybe they hadn't connected the dots, that they didn't realize the man they'd been warned about was the same one being praised on national platforms.
But the truth was better. They had connected the dots, and they liked my version better. I didn't have to hear from my father to know he'd noticed. His silence told me more than words ever could. The man who always had an opinion about everything, especially my life, suddenly had nothing to say. Claire called me one afternoon, her voice tight with a mix of amusement and disbelief. "Dad's different lately," she said. "He's quieter. A few of his friends have been asking him about you. He either changes the subject or gives really short answers." That's not like him. I could picture it. The same man who'd once lectured me about the real world, now sitting through dinners where his friends praised my work in the same breath they used to praise his. For a man like him, that was a slow kind of defeat, the kind that aided him from the inside. Then came the moment that told me the tide had fully turned. I got a call from one of the investors my father had spooked months earlier. "Adrian, I think we might have been given some bad intel about you. I'd like to revisit the conversation we had in January." Bad intel. That was one way to put it. I kept my voice steady, even as a part of me wanted to laugh. "I'd be happy to talk," I said, "but this time, let's deal in facts." The summit in New York was 2 weeks away, and the buzz around it was already building. I knew my father's contacts would be there. It was unavoidable. The closer we got to the date, the more I started hearing second-hand comments that confirmed exactly what I wanted. He was losing grip on his version of events. People were asking him pointed questions, questions he couldn't answer without admitting the truth. Marcus called it the collapse of the scaffolding. Once you start pulling out the support beams of a false story, it can't stand on its own for long. My father had built his scaffolding out of doubt and half-truths. Now it was shaking with every headline and every handshake I posted. I'd be lying if I said there wasn't satisfaction in it. But it wasn't gloating. It was more like relief. For years, I'd been fighting uphill against a perception I couldn't control. Now, without me raising my voice or knocking on his door, the truth was dismantling that perception in front of the same audience he'd been trying to sway. The night before I flew to New York, I stood on my deck, looking at the moonlit water. I thought about that night when he told me to leave, the anger in his eyes, the finality in his voice. Back then, I'd felt like I'd lost something. Now I realized I'd gained something far more valuable: freedom from his approval. What was coming next wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure, about stepping into that summit stage, knowing that no matter what he said after, the truth would already be out there, bigger, louder, and impossible to take back. And for the first time in my life, I was looking forward to seeing the look on his face when he heard it.
The Summit Ballroom in New York was vast. High ceilings, bright lights, and an energy that buzzed like a live wire. Rows of chairs stretched out before the stage, already filling with executives, journalists, and tech insiders. I'd spoken at big events before, but this one was different. This was the stage I'd been building toward for months. As I waited backstage, I scanned the crowd through a narrow gap in the curtain. I recognized a few faces from my father's circle, people who had known me since I was a teenager. Some had been cold or dismissive over the years. Now they were here, programs in hand, waiting for my keynote on the real future of AI in industry. When the announcer called my name, Adrian Voss, founder and CEO of Voss Intelligence, the applause was polite but curious. I walked out calmly, shoulders squared, not rushing. The first thing I noticed was the camera flashes. The second was a ripple of surprise across certain faces in the audience, as if they'd been expecting someone smaller. I began with the story of our company. Not the numbers yet, just the journey. I talked about the early days, the one-bedroom apartment, the nights without sleep, the rejections that nearly broke us. I painted the picture of resilience without bitterness. And then I moved into the work itself, the breakthroughs, the partnerships, the industries we'd impacted. Every slide on the massive screen behind me carried weight. Contract figures, client testimonials, innovations tested and proven in the field. The audience wasn't just hearing about success, they were seeing it, documented and undeniable. About 20 minutes in, I revealed the recent deals. The robotics integration, the healthcare diagnostics, the defense tech project. I didn't just name drop, I laid out the scope and the numbers. 8 figures here, government contracts there, real-world applications that had already saved companies millions and improved lives. That was when I saw it. In the 4th row, 2 seats from the aisle. My father. I hadn't been told he'd be here. He was sitting stiffly, his eyes locked on me, but his expression was unreadable. I didn't flinch. I kept speaking, but in that moment, the presentation became more than a keynote. It became the final move in a long game. I wasn't addressing him directly, but every word I said, every number, every accomplishment dismantled the version of me he'd tried to sell to others. When I finished, the room erupted in applause. Not polite this time, genuine. People stood, cameras kept flashing. I shook hands, answered questions, and posed for photos. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him stand and make his way toward the exit. I caught up to him just before he left the lobby. We didn't shake hands, we didn't hug. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the conflict behind his eyes. Pride, resentment, maybe even regret. All he said was, "You've done well for yourself." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't approval, but it was the closest he'd ever come. And in that moment, I realized I didn't need anything more from him. I had already won, not by defeating him, but by building something he couldn't tear down. That night as I boarded my flight back to Florida, I thought about the months of silence, the whispers, the slow unraveling of his story. The truth was out now, and it wasn't going anywhere. For the first time in years, the weight was gone. Flying back to Florida, I watched the city lights fade beneath the clouds and felt something I hadn't in a long time: stillness. Not the stillness of defeat, but the kind that follows a battle well fought. The summit had been more than a presentation. It had been the quiet, undeniable answer to months, years of doubt. When I landed, the air was warm, the kind of humid embrace that Florida is known for. I drove straight to the beach house, the moon high and the waves folding over themselves in that steady rhythm I'd come to love. I walked out to the shoreline, my shoes in one hand, letting the water rush over my feet. It struck me that the man who had told me to pack my bags and get out would never have imagined this ending, me here, not just surviving, but thriving. The weeks that followed were different. The phone rang more often. Old contacts reaching out, not because they'd heard from my father, but because they'd seen the truth for themselves. Investors I thought I'd lost came back. Journalists wanted follow-up stories. Even people in my father's circle began bypassing him to speak to me directly. I didn't seek confrontation with him after New York. There was nothing left to prove. Whatever he thought of me now was his to wrestle with, not mine to fix. Claire told me he'd spoken less about me lately, and when he did, the tone had shifted. Not praise exactly, but no more poison in the words. One afternoon, a package arrived at the beach house. No return address. Inside was a photograph, me at the summit shaking hands with the CTO of the robotics firm, cameras flashing. Tucked into the frame was a single note in my father's handwriting. I was wrong. No signature, no explanation. I stood there for a long time holding it. It wasn't redemption. It didn't erase the years or the words, but it was a recognition, however small, that he could no longer deny who I was and what I'd built. The truth is, the real victory wasn't the partnerships or the revenue milestones. It wasn't the headlines or the applause. It was the shift inside me. I had walked away from the need for his approval. The moment I stopped trying to earn it, I became free to succeed on my own terms. People think revenge has to be loud,
a confrontation, a public shaming, a final cutting remark. But sometimes the most devastating revenge is living so well, so completely that the lies crumble on their own. My father had tried to paint me as unstable, reckless, doomed to fail. The man standing on that stage in New York made that version of me impossible to believe. Now, when I wake up to the sound of the waves and sunlight spilling through the curtains, I don't think about what he said that night. I think about the fact that I left without a word, and that in leaving, I created the space to become the man I was meant to be. If I ever see him again, really see him, not in a crowd, not in passing, I'll thank him. Not for the insult, not for the sabotage, but for pushing me out the door. Because sometimes the fastest way to prove someone wrong is to stop trying to convince them and just start building the life they said you couldn't. In the end, I didn't move to Florida to hide. I moved here to live. And every sunrise reminds me, the best revenge is a life no one can take credit for but you.